Welcome to InnerTV. I'm Althea Provost, and today's guest is Lenie Reedijk. To influence the future, we start by understanding our distant past. In this interview, we will explore the ancient temples of Malta. Allow me to introduce Lenie Reedijk. Born in the Netherlands, judicial translator by profession, studied English at the University of Utrecht and German language and literature in Amsterdam and Berlin. In Berlin, she participated as a translator in the book project on Maltese literature, which brought her to Malta. She lived in Malta from 1990 to 1996, working as an interpreter. During this period, her interest in Maltese ancient temple ruins was awakened. Author of Archaeological Walks on Gozo and Sirius, the Star of Maltese Temple. Welcome, Lenie Reedijk, to InnerTV.
Thank you for having me, Althea.
Before we explore your theory on dating the Maltese temples, please share with our audience why the conventional narrative posited by the British archaeologists needs to be re-examined.
Well, my book is about discovery of the purpose of the Maltese temples and their true antiquity. But because what I found is entirely different from the conventional narrative, I necessarily also deal with the issue of why this could not be discovered earlier and why the dating of the temples in Malta has been the subject of controversy for a very long time. I thank you, Althea, for allowing me to talk about this somewhat thorny issue. Malta was a British colony from 1800 until 1964, and in the first 100 years of British rule, nothing much happened in the archaeological arena. But then, around 1900, someone landed in Malta who would change all this, and through his influence, Malta's megalithic temples would become tied up with a project, or I would call it rather a scheme, which would ultimately have the effect of denying Malta's temple culture any role in human cultural history. And the person I'm talking about is Arthur Evans, or Sir Arthur Evans, who would become famous as the excavator of the palace of Knossos in Crete. And this palace, which was not excavated yet, but it was already designated to become the cradle of European civilization. Evans had personally bought the site in Crete, and he came to Malta in 1897, a few years before the start of his excavations there. It's clear that when he visited Malta, he already had in mind his project in Crete and the role it would be given in the cultural history of Europe. So this role was to be denied to Malta, and from this time onwards, the Maltese temples would be placed in the shadow of Crete and were not allowed to be given an older date. This meant that if the Cretan palace was a Bronze Age site, the Maltese temples were not allowed to predate it, and they were assigned a Bronze Age date too. When a few decades later an Italian archaeologist challenged this interpretation, he was heavily criticized, and his work was discarded as fascist propaganda. And even after the Second World War, this British policy regarding the Maltese temples was continued until the introduction of radiocarbon dating in the 60s, which then revealed Neolithic dates for the objects that were found inside the temples. And these objects were dated to around 4000 BC. So now the temples themselves were therefore older than Crete and could in principle claim the title of cradle of European civilization, wouldn't they? So to solve this problem, the archaeologists working in Malta introduced the theory that the Maltese temples were an isolated affair and had no influence whatsoever on any cultural development outside Malta. So this is also the reason, in my view, why the temples of Malta have remained so relatively unknown to most people in the rest of the world.
It's like they became an isolated island when in fact it was connected to Italy and throughout the Mediterranean. This was a temple culture. It was shared. And now we are revisiting a history that compartmentalized each island or each location of a temple to itself, showing a singularity instead of a uniform culture.
Yes, that is my interpretation. And it was a sort of a fashion within archaeology altogether during the 70s. So I would say 50 years ago, to introduce the idea that every culture in the islands in the Mediterranean existed purely on their own.
That they weren't trading goods and or influencing each other or had some type of systematic ideology that was shared throughout the islands.
This last one, yes. I mean, of course, archaeologists had to acknowledge that they were trading goods because, for instance, in Malta, in the earliest times, so in Stone Age times, they found stone objects that came from the Aeolian Islands or Pantelleria or even from North Italy. So, but they considered this to be just goods that somehow so haphazardly landed in Malta and were not regarded as signs of an extensive trade all over the place, you know.
We don't want to brand the British archaeologists as having, let's just say, one certain ideology that they were determined to pass down. We can only hope that future archaeologists will be interested in re-examining this narrative and being sensitive to the fact that megalithic cultures were in fact a worldwide experience and continued through time, and that they had an understanding of temple building that was beyond our current understanding.
Yes, you see, at the moment, we live in very fascinating times because there are many independent researchers that already have come to this conclusion. But it will take time before mainstream will also see the light, so to speak, in this matter.
So we'll start with your book. It presents a theory based on the precision of the equinoxes that Malta's temples are far older than the conventional dating. If the temples are aligned to Sirius, from what period do these temples date from?
Well, according to the dates derived from the precession of Sirius, temple building in Malta started in the Mesolithic around 9000 BC, before Christ, and it started, therefore, as soon as Sirius became visible above the southern horizon at the latitude of Malta, which is around 36 degrees north. The first temple, according to this dating, was one of the smallest. It is Hypogeum North, which is orientated slightly west of south to the setting position of Sirius around 9150 BC. And from then on, the building of temples follows the slow movement of Sirius along the horizon into a northerly direction, both east and west of south. And according to this dating method, the last temple to be built was also the largest. It is Gigantea South in Gozo, which points to the rising position of Sirius in around 4250 BC. This means that the beginning of temple building in Malta coincides with the beginning of the first temples at Göbekli Tepe in southeast Turkey, which is situated also around the latitude 36 or 37 degrees north. And its excavator, the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, dated it to around 9200 BC. And then based on this date, the Italian astronomer Giulio Magli suggests in an article which you can find online that Göbekli Tepe too may have been orientated to Sirius.
Yes, I did see that. Did Malta become the forgotten middle child? Not the stellar first, not the darling baby. When you look at your north, we're saying 9150. That would be to the winter solstice, right? That's when the star is appearing at that temple site, correct?
Not during the winter solstice, sorry, no. The stars have a different rhythm of rising and setting than the sun has. If I say that Hypogeum North was orientated to the setting of Sirius around 9100 BC, like we said, then this means that its heliacal rising occurs at this date, and the heliacal rising of a star is much different from the daily rising and setting of the sun. My book is about the astronomical dating according to the movement of Sirius along the horizon. So the discussion of what is heliacal rising or setting has not been relevant for my book. That would be the subject of the next one. I also cannot prove that they were from the very start watching this first rising of the star in front of the sun. But it happened in July. And the setting, the final setting, the heliacal setting of the star every year happened in around mid or beginning of May, depending on what time period you look at.
For our audience who hasn't been to Malta, Hypogeum is located next to, or not even next to, there's several temples on that peninsula. There's some minor ones, and then farther down the path, there is Manaja. So did Manaja come, when you examined that, it's definitely facing a different orientation. What did you learn about that?
The Nidal temples are 500 meters downhill from Hypogeum. And the Nidal temples consist of three. There is, first of all, the small one, which is orientated to the setting of Sirius soon after the small Hypogeum temple was built. But I think you are referring to Nidal South, which is a larger temple, which forms part of this complex. And Nidal South is very interesting. It is the only temple which was orientated precisely east. And it has even been accepted by archaeologists that this means that it was directed, that it was pointing, and it still does, to the rising sun of the equinoxes. And the equinoxes are the 21st of March, the beginning of spring, and the 21st of September, which is the beginning of autumn.
Seeing some sun worship, aren't we?
Also, yes, certainly.
And also there, I noticed during my time, and I took a picture and I'll probably put it up on the video, that there was lunar calendrical markings on the stones. They were paying attention to the rising of the sun or the setting of the sun, as well as the moon, including stars. We're really looking at an astronomical society.
Exactly. And the whole motivation. Well, first of all, let me say that because Nidal South has been proven, and there is no controversy about it, it has been accepted by everybody under the sun, that this was orientated to the equinoxes. That gives me legitimacy to look at the sky for an answer for the orientations of all the other temples too. You see?
I agree with you. And it's like if the first temple builders were astronomers who were aligning their megalithic structures to the stars, why is conventional archaeologists discrediting this research?
They do not discredit the research in principle, as long as it sticks to the dates that they give to the temples. But it's a very good question. You see, my book appeared in 2018, and the reaction of conventional archaeology has been twofold. Well, first of all, we heard that my dates differ by at least, sometimes over 5,000 years from the dates given by archaeology. But surprisingly, my book was criticized only once, and for the rest it was ignored. As was to be expected, the dates that I found for the temples were discredited during this one critical voice. The criticism pointed to the radiocarbon dates. But this is a rather tame response, you see, because 50 years ago, a handful of radiocarbon dates were produced during the excavations at Skorba, And no reliable radiocarbon tests have been done in temple period levels in any of the other above-ground temples. All the other temples were dated by means of the style of the potsherds found inside them. And in general, the dating of the temples rests on only a few radiocarbon dates from objects inside scarba, and which do not tell us anything about the time when the temple itself was built, because stone buildings themselves cannot be dated with this technique. And this has been pointed out before, interestingly enough, by Graham Hancock, for instance, in his book Underworld, which deals extensively with this issue of the very shaky basis on which the dating of the temples in Malta rests. And there are only so few radiocarbon dates at all, and they date from the 60s. There has been complete silence from the side of the archaeologists regarding the first part of my book, which is very interesting, I think. I mean, the silence, because this part deals with the manipulations in the past to keep the dates of the temples in the Bronze Age. But I also go a step further in this part of the book. I just told you that they wanted the palace of Knossos in Crete and not the temples of Malta to be called the cradle of European civilization. But now we can ask, why is this? And I found the answer to this question too. It is only 150 years ago that the belief that man was created by God in around 3000 BC was challenged and replaced by Darwin's theory of evolution, which made the species of man a few million years old, and Homo sapiens sapiens, to which we belong, was around 200,000 years old. In his work on the origin of species, Darwin does not express himself about any cultural development of humans, knowing that this would be a very controversial topic, a hot potato, so to speak. This job was tackled by a circle of men who were all friends of Darwin, and they called themselves the X Club. They came together in London over a period of about 10 years. And during this time, they composed a theory of cultural evolution, which they all agreed to, and which is now referred to as social Darwinism. Through the publication of many voluminous books, they were so extremely influential that even today we ourselves are steeped in this doctrine without even realizing it. It is the theory that all cultures, past and present, evolve along the same unilinear cultural line all over the world. They all go through the same cultural stages, namely from being primitive savages to barbarians only, and then on to us, civilized society. This theory equated the people of the Stone Age with primitives that had no religion, but believed in nature spirits and venerated their ancestors, also called a death cult. And their life was so difficult that they had no time to do anything else but just look for food.
Or build megalithic structures that we can't build today.
In this vision of the world, they didn't even have the time. So the old people from the old and middle Stone Age couldn't have done it in this view. This thinking, this theory goes on to say that the Bronze Age people had evolved towards being only barbarians with a belief in many gods, and that this stage again evolved into the monotheistic religions, which would then develop into the scientific age in which we live. So the people in the Stone Age, in short, were equated with primitive savages. And because this theory is still very much alive, you will find in Malta, in the visitor centers, even today, the explanation that the temple builders practiced a death cult which refers to this ancestor cult, you see. We need to be aware of this. So in my book, I think, and I hope, I succeeded in revealing the root of the prejudice that Stone Age people were primitive, and why the work of independent researchers like myself, who proved that they were intelligent skywatchers and astronomers, and that they were great architects and artists, that this perspective will always be discredited so long as we don't expose the original theory behind their prejudices. This originally British doctrine is very much ingrained in archaeology all over the world. This is why we rarely will find an archaeologist who will be open to the idea that during the Stone Age, a civilization existed probably all over the world, like you said already, which was intelligent and very successful.
Very, very sophisticated culture. From my travels to sacred sites, there is an understanding and a feeling that the ground and the earth will continue to have us revisit our narrative or the narrative passed down so that we can begin to truly understand the exquisite nature of their mind and of their mentality to create structures that can last through time, but also be reoriented to the stars to receive planetary influence and what that planetary influence meant to them. What type of message were they trying to tell us? On page 162, you write, "The implications are indeed immense, not just for our way of thinking about people living in the remote past, but foremost for ourselves. My interpretation of the megalithic achievement in the Maltese lands means nothing less than a paradigm shift. Once freeing ourselves from the dictates of the old 19th century philosophies of our past, new vistas open before eyes of our legacy that we never dreamed existed." What did you discover about the matriarchal culture in Malta?
I do not use the word or refer to the word matriarchy or matriarchal culture in my book for the reason that it has become unclear what is meant by it. But if we could define it as an egalitarian society which was centered around preserving life instead of centered around conquering neighboring countries, then I would agree that we could, during our conversation, call it matriarchal.
Let's just say, as we're digging through the layers of time and reviewing the archaeological notes, we do not find a civilization warring. We don't find warring artifacts and disturbances of death as in a death culture. What we do find is not just pottery, but incense burners, a lot of jewelry for women.
Exactly. You only find very beautiful stuff, which is also very appealing and also, very fresh. It has a direct impact on you when you look at it. There is you don't need to interpret it. It's grabbing you immediately.
We find exquisite statuary venerating the female form. I won't even say goddess, or I won't even attempt to give it a gender, but let's just say a very full expression of a body that is exquisitely drawn to scale, and one that would take time, effort to model, fire, all these things.
Yes, and not only that, the temples were built not only as observatories to the stars, but also as places where all these crafts could find a roof over their head. The young generation of archaeologists in Malta and in Italy, I should say, are have done research into this, and it is extraordinary that they found that that the temples were also production centers of arts and crafts. So all this was going on there.
Showing through their exquisite carvings and animal detail. Since you've pushed the datings back, and we're going from 3,000 to 5,000 to 4,000 to 9,000, we're seeing a sophisticated culture that was able to produce enough food and create a lifestyle that allowed them to produce crafts and goods and to have the time to skywatch and to have ceremony for their belief systems, if that's the case.
Exactly, they had time, and in my view, they were without any pressure from any authority above them, you see. And I think we cannot even fathom how human beings are, what we are as human beings, without any pressure, without having to pay taxes, without having to watch the clock. That is as simple as I see it, because we cannot know who we are without these pressures. And I think there is more to see, not just the craft and the art as artistic accomplishment, but also I think they tell us a story. For instance, these spiral motifs from the temple of Tarjin, for instance, but you find them in every temple. To me, they read like a script of people who tell us about a worldview and so a sort of a philosophy that they handed down and therefore carved in stone. And this worldview speaks about a psychical recurrence of everything, a sort in symbolic form. They tell us about the cycles of life and death, as well as the cycles of the sun and the moon and the stars in the sky. On one of the motifs in a Tarjin altar, you can see these spirals, these symbolical cycles in two long rows, the one above the other, which could be read as the correspondence of the cycles in the sky and on Earth. So the correspondence between the revolutions of the stars and the cycles of life on Earth. So the early wisdom which is preserved in this language in the older stones of Tarjin is astonishing. It's, in my view, it's modern. And I think that these ancient people may have been even physically in touch with this experience of synchronicity of the material world on Earth and the spiritual world above, without letting one of these worlds running away from the other.
A holistic viewpoint. Let's walk over from Tarjin to Hypogeum, which is in the town of Paula. How do you view the philosophy or the symbology associated with the Hypogeum?
It's a living philosophy, that's how I see it. And we can ourselves feel it in the Hypogeum. We haven't talked about it yet. This is an underground temple, and there is an acoustic experience built inside it. So the sound effects that can be produced there can cause a trance-like state for people who are sensitive to it. Some of us are still sensitive to it as well. And this shows to me that they knew how to reach other states of consciousness without the use of drugs.
There's a snake pit. It's been referred to as the death cult. And we have D.H. Trump, the archaeologist that went in there. Are we alluding to the fact that they were perhaps exploring snake venom?
Possibly. I don't know about that. Or you mean they use it as a drug?
Correct.
Okay. I think anything is possible. We can only learn to understand them completely when our own when we use all our faculties, not just our brain, but our experience, and that is the blessing of the Hypogeum, this acoustic experience, is reproducible today, which is fantastic.
So for our audience that might not know, there was long-headed skulls found inside the Hypogeum. The Hypogeum has been acoustically tested and suggested through its testing that it beats to or has a harmonic resonance to 111 hertz. In addition, there is an oracle hole where we would say maybe the priest, this could be reaching, but the priestess or whoever was in charge of that ceremonial or burial center would stand in front of an oracle hole and tone or sing or make some sound that would make that Hypogeum come alive.
Exactly.
I did that. I know we're not supposed to, but I did do that during my visit. And as a clairvoyant, I had some experiences that showed me that the Hypogeum isn't necessarily fully understood today, how and why they would go to antlers, dig underneath limestone to carve out an exquisite 3-story burial center for their people. I mean, if they were just hunter and gatherers with not a lot of food and time, why would they go through such extensive work to create something so methodical and at the same time provide artwork of bulls and spirals and celestial sky markings onto the walls if we were believing the 19th century philosophies at the time?
Yes, well, the brilliant Maltese archaeologist Thea, who excavated the Hypogeum, he told us that it was a temple before it was a burial place. And that is the solution to the fact that we find works of art on the ceiling, that the carvings were so very beautiful. It represents one of the rooms have carvings of a facade of a temple above the ground, but then reproduced underneath the ground. And why would you do it if you're going to use it as a burial place? So Zamit's observations is I think correct. The temple, the use of the Hypogeum as a temple and the building of the Hypogeum long predates the use of it as a grave.
Correct. And, so for people who haven't been there, I'll run some pictures. There's a trilithum entrance. There's corbelled roofs. It's exquisite. What happened? What do you believe the bull fresco is representing?
Well, first of all, it's gone. Because it represents washed away.
Washed away.
Yes. I noted it in my book. It was confirmed to me by one of the wardens of the Hypogeum who received this order himself to go down with a bucket and wash the paint from that wall. So the bull is gone, but there are pictures of it. And it was a very ancient bull. Probably that's the reason why it was removed, but that is only my opinion. And I think we haven't talked about this, and maybe it's not. There is no time to talk about it in this interview. But there are many indications. There are many pieces of evidence, tangible pieces, apart from just temple orientations, but objects that date to the old Stone Age, which have either disappeared or have never been properly examined or investigated, you see.
I would like to say that bull is throughout the Mediterranean, and these objects keep coming up. They keep finding them and throwing them away, but the truth is they're going to keep coming up because our ancient ancestors were prolific.
Oh, yes. You mean they will be found wherever you look for them?
I think we're going to continue to discover more and more evidence of what we're trying to wash away. There is a Hypogeum in the area, a second Hypogeum that has not been excavated. That's there's a dirt field, and in between it, 2 houses, and it's surrounded by a fence. There is more and more to come. It's not one and done. Let's put it that way. As we become more sensitive to the fact that our history needs to be revisited and, on some practical level, re-examined.
Especially Malta.
Especially Malta.
You are very, very much up to date about what happens in Malta. So you may have read too that a few years ago they applied ground penetrating radar around the area of Schrop-Lagine, which is one of the temple sites found 100 years ago. Then on that same site, a new temple was discovered. It's just, the outlines and the stones. And the outlines, the ground plan was still intact. So I asked the discoverer what the orientation was, and it was southeast, so outside the range of the sun. So it was an orientation within the range of the Sirius, the rising Sirius. I could date it if he would send me the ground plan. I mean to say this, that Malta needs to be supported to take very well care of their country, because at the moment they are, by this building boom, there is a danger that ancient sites are being destroyed all over the place because it is so full of them.
I agree with you, and I felt that when I was there. But again, the more your book becomes known and read and understood, we can develop a conversation that hopefully will ignite the people in Malta to save their history.
Right.
And so at this time, I want to close with a quote. And on page 163, you say, "During all the decades and centuries that we have been blind to the treasures, we have shortchanged ourselves, failing to see the true gold, the icing on the cake of human cultural endeavor." And with that, if you'd like to know more about Lenie and her work, please visit www.sirius-malta.com. Links will be provided below. Thank you, Lenie, for being on InnerTV.
Thank you so much, Althea. This was a lovely conversation.
It's been a pleasure. And if you'd like to know more about InnerTV, remember to like, share, and subscribe. And until then, bye for now.